Okay, making sure I was recording. Um, Welcome everyone to our adult education for the parables of Jesus. Before we get into today's parable, what I would like to do is address a question that was asked last week that after reviewing the link or reviewing the tape of the class, I didn't like my answer. It wasn't a bad answer, but I guess it's the teacher in me. I felt there was a better answer I could have given, so I want to do that real quick. Um, the question was asked in the parable in Matthew 13, verse 8. Other seeds fell on good soil and brought forth grain, some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. And then in verse 23, it says, but as for that, for what was sown on good soil, this is one who hears the word and understands it, who indeed bears fruit and yields, in one case 100-fold, and another 60, and another 30. And we discussed how the seed was the truth that Jesus taught. That was the love of Christ, to love our neighbor, love our enemies, to basically love thy neighbor as thyself. So how does that increase 100-fold and 60 and 30-fold? And here's the best answer I thought about it, or best explanation I could give. A school teacher, say a high school English teacher, may have 100 students a year that they teach, and they have a career of, say, 20, 25 years. Well, you're looking at hundreds, if not 1,000 or two lives they're going to influence. Whereas, say, a auto mechanic who works in a repair shop may not have nearly as many contacts with people, but still can have a positive influence. So we talked about how don't worry about what somebody else is doing as far as are you benefiting, or are you doing what you're supposed to be doing? And that's what I think really was a better explanation, that basically wherever you're planted, whatever good you can do, you do it. And don't worry about whether or not you're doing as good as somebody else, because Jesus just expects us, or we're just told to do the best we can where we're at. So I think that was a little bit better explanation. May not have been that much different, but I wanted to go ahead and clear that up. So any questions from last week before we get started with this week? Okay. If not, we're going to go into today's parable. Today's parable comes from Matthew 13, 24 through 30 and 36 through 43. It is the parable of the wheat and weeds. And some people know this as the parable of the wheat and tares. That's how I grew up hearing it. So it's just a different word. And we'll get into a little bit of that in just a few minutes. Starting with verse 24. He put before them another parable. The kingdom of heaven may be compared to someone who sowed good seed in his field. But while everyone was asleep, an enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat, and then went away. So when the plants came up and bore a grain, then the weeds appeared as well. And the slaves of the householder came and said to him, Master, did you not sow good seed in your field? Where then did these weeds come from? He answered, An enemy has done this. The slave said to him, Then do you want us to go and gather them? But he replied, No, for in gathering the weeds you would uproot the wheat among them. Let both of them grow together until the harvest, and at harvest time I will tell the reapers, Collect the weeds first and bind them in bundles to be burned, but gather the wheat into my barn. Then go ahead to verse 36. Then he left the crowds and went into the house, and his disciples approached him, saying, Explain to us the parable of the wheats of the field. He answered, The one who sows the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world, and the good seed are the children of the kingdom. The weeds are the children of the evil one, and the enemy who sowed them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, and the reapers are angels. Just as the weeds are collected and burned up with fire, so it will be the end of the age. The Son of Man will send his angels, and they will collect out of his kingdom all causes of sin and all evildoers. And they will throw them into the furnace of fire, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. Let everyone with ears listen. Okay, that's our parable. And let me go ahead and interject. This right here, this space, I'll do something. this space right here, there's actually about 3 or 4 parables that we're going to get to later, another lesson, that Jesus talks about. But the apostles don't ask about that parable. They ask about this parable up here. So, something to keep in mind. Like we said last week, Jesus didn't explain most of his parables, but this is the one last week we talked about. He gave an explanation, and the one this week, there's an explanation as well. I've got a green mark. It'll be okay. So the question I'm going to ask is, anything jump out to anyone just right off the top? Any thoughts, just first impressions?
To me, it does when he mentions the evil one came and did it.
Okay.
That could kind of, like we talked about last week, Satan was not presented in the Bible the way we see him now, as the way it came through the Middle Ages and stuff like that. So this could be more of the trickster coming in, because yes, it's malicious and it could harm his fields, but it didn't overall destroy everything.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's a very good point. Nowhere in here, in this parable, is Satan mentioned. It mentions the enemy. It mentions the devil. And we talked about last week where the idea of demons and devils and those things were more of a Persian influence after captivity than so much this idea of, of the Prince of Darkness and all his demons coming up. One interesting thing to me about it, and like we said last week, Jesus didn't explain most of his parables. And either it was because he was teaching his disciples what they meant, or because the author of Matthew, who wrote Matthew several decades after Jesus left, may have been adding commentary. My personal thought, this is me, my personal belief, nobody else's, that if you look at the parable and then you look at the explanation, it almost is like somebody else is writing the explanation than who's giving the parable. It's a different tenor, different tone, different words to me. So how much of this was Jesus's explanation? Could have been 100%. Or this could have been the author explaining what the parable meant, because this was one that wanted to make an issue or make a sermon on. I don't know. It's just, it's interesting to me how they're different. All right. Anything else jumps out at anybody? All right. Well, I'll just talk a little bit because I talk a lot. And if somebody has a thought or something they want to interject, just start talking, and I'll hush. One thing interesting, and go back to a point Kimmy was making about the evil one, the enemy. All right, came in. The weeds in this parable, I call them tares. I grew up, so if I slip between them and call them weeds or tares, it's about the same thing. Most historians, most theologians, most people in a study of the area believe what was actually the weed is something called darnel. Darnel is a ryegrass that actually, in the early stages of development, looks extremely close to wheat. In fact, you couldn't tell the difference. Of course, darnel you cannot use as wheat. And in fact, under Roman law, if anyone was accused of sowing darnel in a wheat field, it was a punishable crime. So this was a serious concern. It's kind of like for people who, as a relevance, if you cut hay and somebody threw a bunch of army ants in your hay field, it'll destroy your ryegrass, it'll destroy crop. So it's that kind of seriousness that this enemy has done, that has thrown this weeds, this darnel out there amongst them. Question we'll ask to think about for just a second: why, if they noticed it early enough, did he not just have his servants or slaves. We use I use the New Revised Standard Version that uses the word slaves. Other versions use servants, and whether I think Father Andrew does a good job of explaining the differences. And that's actually a whole nother lesson for another day. But anyway, his slaves, his servants come to him, and he told them, no, for in gathering weeds, you'll uproot the wheat among them. If they caught it early enough, why was that a concern of the master, the landowner? Any
My thought
thoughts?
is because you do more, my
I'm
thought
sorry.
is you do more damage. You would do more damage because you are uprooting some of the wheat that could still grow and be productive. Where if you wait
Mm-hmm.
till the end, it'll all grow and you might use that darnel for something else rather than just throwing away everything.
That's a good point. That's a good thought. Think about in a situation like with benevolence. I use this analogy here. We give benevolently. Angels Attic, we use those funds to help support other missions with the church. We do food pantries. We participate and give donations to the needy, to the sick. One thing I remember growing up, and I'm from an evangelical background, so I have a little different take on things sometimes, was the debate that always happened in church with how much benevolence do you do? And what I mean by that is, if we give this much, give as 100% of what's been asked of us, then there's probably going to be some people that take advantage of it, people who don't need the benevolence, people that are just simply using the church to benefit themselves or to, not have to do for themselves when they're capable. But you get everybody covered that needs it, you're just going to have some waste because there are going to be people that will abuse it. On the other side of the aisle is, no, let's make sure that we can just verify 100% that every penny we use is actually going to be needed or used as needed. And that means that we may miss some people here or there that could use the help, but we're just more concerned about wasting that we're not going to do that. And you say, well, what does that got to do with pulling up the weeds? Well, like Kimmy said, if I'm concerned about making sure I get all of the wheat that I need, I'm gonna hold off and say, you know what, let it grow. We'll get it when it's time, and that way we can benefit most. And yes, it may cause us a little bit of work down on the other end. But if you go ahead and start weeding now, yeah, we're going to get all the weeds, and it's going to be nothing but grain. But like Kimmy said, you're going to pull up some wheat too, so some benefit that could have happened won't get to happen. So I guess it's just a philosophy to an extent that it could happen. Because I know back in these times, what would happen was it was very common that you would either poison the whole field or you would burn the field, as when you couldn't, because it was such labor intensiveness to try to separate the wheat from the weeds. So you have to be dedicated to do that. So that's another thought there.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
And also you've got the cost of, if you do burn the whole field, you've lost all that, the whole thing. And then you come back over even with the expense of doing it.
You're exactly correct. And that was why it was such a stiff fine or such a punishment under Roman law. And I think, Kimmy, you alluded to something else. Darnel can be used as fuel for fire. In fact, one of the interesting things is collect the weeds first and bind them in bundles to be burned. He didn't say get the wheat first and go put it in the barn and then burn the field off. That would be a way just to, if you could just gather the wheat first, gather the wheat, take it in and burn the rest of it. He said, let's bundle the darnel, let's bundle the tares, let's bundle the weeds to be burned. So that indicates that he's getting something useful out of the weeds, that he is actually saying, hey, this is some fuel that we can use, so let's bundle it. Let's bundle it up so we can use it later. Because if you're just going to burn it, you just pile it up and burn. You wouldn't waste the time of bundling this weed to be burned. So I think that's also a very good point as well, that some have indicated that in that particular point, Jesus is alluding to, you know what? Even things that we think may not be of any use can still be used. And a person that is wise, a person that is listening, can very easily go and say, you know what? Everything can be used. We just have to look at it. And how is this supposed curse? I got tares in my field. I now have a blessing because now I've got fuel for my fires that I didn't have before. Any thoughts on that? Anybody want to comment or interject something?
That's just a great explanation, because I was wondering why they didn't take the wheat first. So that's great. You explained it.
And that's just one perspective. I mean, this morning in the homily that Father Andrew is going to talk about at the in-person service, talks about the first being last and last being first. Maybe this is another reference to that what we consider first, we're going to deal with last. And what we consider the last or the least, we're going to deal with first. And that's one of the things about the parables. If we should always, when we read a parable, we should always get a new insight or a different insight, because we're growing, we're learning, we're developing. And so I never want to say what I say is right 100%. That's just my perspective. And that's why I love to hear other perspectives as well, because it may be something I didn't think about.
I have one total random thought I just went on.
Okay, go ahead.
Could that also be how we treat people? Sometimes we see people with no value, where if we would look further, we could find more value in them to be used.
I love that. I absolutely love that. And that brings me to a thought I have had before reading this parable. As school teachers, we have a class, say 25 students come in. We don't know, especially young ones, as they get older, they kind of start developing their personalities and so forth. But think about a third grade teacher going to teach reading to these kids, and she walks into their class, whether it's, male, female, doesn't matter, but walks in the class and they see these students. If they have a prejudgment, somebody may have told them, "Oh, watch out for Johnny over there. Johnny's real bad," or Sue's parents are prominent members of the church, and so we got to take care of them. Or Thomas over there. Thomas's dad is very influential in town, and got to watch out for that. If we prejudge and determine who is good, who is worthy, who's not, are we not pulling weeds up before we allow the wheat to develop? So to me, this is also giving us a warning to say, you know what? Be careful about judging how somebody is going to be too quickly. Be careful about determining what's going to be good and what's going to be not, because especially before the germination happens, before the full development happens, you really don't know. You may think you know it's a wheat, and you may think you know it's a tare, but you may be wrong. And that's why, to me, the master says, no, in gathering, you would uproot the wheat, let them both grow together in the harvest. And at the harvest, we'll take care of it. Something else to me interesting about this parable. We've talked about different things. One thing is about letting them grow together. I've heard a commentary before that they basically said the reason you let them grow together is a statement of, we can't retreat from the world. We're going to be surrounded by people that are going to be wheat. There are going to be people that we're going to be surrounded by that are going to be weeds. They're going to be tares. And this is almost a warning, according to the commentary I read, not to try to isolate or remove yourself from others, from society, but to be a part of it, because you don't know the wheat. You don't know the tares. Now, does that mean we can pick out bad behavior? Yes, we can. Can we determine the type of people we don't want to associate with? Of course. But to me, it's more of a, let's not isolate ourselves to the point that we have no influence, because who knows, maybe a tear is just wheat that hadn't developed yet. I don't know. That was just a commentary that popped up, and I just was going to share it and see what you thought.
I like that statement, that it may develop into wheat. Isn't that interesting? That's so true.
Mm-hmm.
We have to give them a chance.
I agree. And I think we fail that sometimes, not only as Christians, but as people. We're quick to judge. Yeah. We're quick to criticize. And like we talked about last week, I think part of it, we're now so in tune, many of us, with social media, with the different ways of dealing with folks. We don't have enough sit down discussions and get to know people. I've used this analogy before. One of the tragic events of American society are that houses these days are not built with front porches. You know, that was the gathering place that people would go sit on the front porch in the evening, see the kids ride bikes down the road, or they'd see their neighbors out for a walk and they'd socialize. But now with television, computers, internet, smartphones, we go inside, we shut the door. You know, we don't make those personal connections like we used to. Now, does that have anything to do with this parable? Not really. It's just a thought that popped in my head. couple of other things I want to talk about with this parable that's interesting, and I'm going to go down to the explanation. The one who sows the seed, this is verse 37, is the Son of Man. Now, that's an interesting phrase, because Son of Man has been interpreted different ways. Jesus has also been referred to as the Son of God. So in this, the seed, the one who sows the seed is the Son of Man. Some have said they're interchangeable. Son of Man, Son of God, saying the same thing. Some have argued, however, that no, they're two different things. That when you see the Son of Man, you're making a connection that this person they're talking about is direct lineage of Adam, because Adam means man. So if you're seeing somebody say the Son of Man, you're basically seeing the reference, saying the son of Adam, which is to demonstrate this, a fancy way of just saying a man, that there's nothing special about it. Of course, others have said, no, it's synonymous with the Son of God. The interesting thing about the Son of God is that really only in Luke is there any reference of Jesus indicating that he himself was God. John, Matthew, Mark, and Luke did not. John was the gospel who was real interested in proving the deity of Christ. Is the only one that really had where Jesus referred to himself as God. So that's kind of interesting that we think that Jesus, in this explanation is talking about himself as the Son of Man, the Son of God. Was he? I don't know. I don't. It's just an interesting commentary that someone brought up, that we refer to Jesus often as the Son of God, that he is, he was God, he was man. People didn't always view that. In fact, it wasn't until about the 5th century that they actually came together to decide what was the actual man deity of Jesus, because there was Christians that were teaching that really Jesus was kind of this blend, this God, human, demigod, hybrid thingy, kind of nebulous. And it was such a controversy that actually in 457 AD, after the Catholic Church decided how it's going to be, they actually called that teaching a heresy, and it had been going on for over 400 years. So it's interesting, like we said last week, Jesus was a Jew. He was born a Jew. He followed Judaism. He died a Jew. When we look at these parables in the terms of our Christianity, it gives us a different meaning than maybe what Jesus was intended at the time. So maybe when he was talking about being the Son of Man, was he talking about being the Son of God? Maybe. Maybe he was just talking about being the Son of Man. Or maybe, like I've said before, verse 36 on may just simply be commentary by the person who wrote Matthew, in not really what Jesus said, because again, to me, the words, if you read the parable, then you read the explanation that is given, it gets really into angels and devils and righteousness and fires of weeping and gnashing of teeth that really, in other parables, Jesus, it didn't fit very well. Does that make sense? Or is it just kind of like, oh, Shannon, you're just crazy. You don't know what you're talking about.
Where Jesus is quoted, that's never anything that he really discusses.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it does seem like it could be from a different voice.
And it may not be. But we did talk about last week that, like you said before, Kimmy, that the view of Satan has changed over time. The view of who Satan is, it was, the trickster, the adversary, and all. So how much of this is influenced by a changing view of Jesus just being a teacher or a prophet, and now becoming someone maybe more a deity, the Messiah? I don't know, but it's interesting. But the reason I included this with this parable, of course, it's in it. But this and last week's were the only two parables that was ever given an explanation for. Like next week, when we start the parables next week, there won't be an explanation given in the Bible. We have to figure it out. It's almost like, okay, if this was Jesus, he said, I've taught you. You should have paid attention. Now up to you to figure out what the rest of it is. I also think it's interesting, like I said, from verse 30 to 36, there are 2, 3, 4 more parables, but the apostles or the disciples didn't ask about explaining those. And what's funny to me is when we get into those, they're going to be probably just as difficult or even more difficult to possibly understand, because there's going to be some weird things about them. And I'm going to save them for you because I want us to read them together, just as when Jesus ministered, he threw it at them the first time. So I want to be able to look at it that way and not give too much away of what we're going to do next week.
Okay.
Let me see, because this has actually gone by pretty quickly, because we're at about the 10:33, and I want to finish up in the next couple of minutes. I'm looking over my notes in case anybody's wondering what I'm looking at, because I want to make sure that I've covered the big things, because we could always, spend lots and lots of time all right. I do want to bring up one thing to think about, and think about it this week. Last week I said, think about what if the explanation was not really from Jesus. It was from the author of Matthew. And this week's lesson kind of gives us that exact example of why we want to think about whether the explanation was right or from Jesus, because Jesus doesn't explain anything else. This is the one I want to have you think about and chew on over the week, and when we come together next week, address. Verse 24, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to someone who sowed good seed in the field. The kingdom of heaven is a term that is used a lot in parables, but Jesus also uses the term kingdom of God. Are they the same? Are they different? There's some indication that most theologians will say, they're basically the same thing. Kingdom of God, kingdom of heaven, same thing we're talking about here. But there is some scholarly debate that no, the kingdom of heaven refers to, or let me back up, the kingdom of God refers to a physical earthly manifestation. Like the Israelites, the Jews, they believed that their Messiah was going to be an actual person that was going to come and reestablish the kingdom of Israel. Okay, kingdom of God, that verse. The kingdom of heaven, the argument goes, is talking about a spiritual indwelling. That we're not talking about the physical realm, we're talking about the spiritual, we're talking about the soul, we're talking about those things. So if that's the case, and like I said, that's not the overwhelming view. That's a small view, but that is a very compelling view, because if that's the case, and in this verse it talks about the kingdom of heaven may be compared to someone who sowed seed in his field. How would that affect thus not talking about an actual kingdom, but an indwelling of the love of Jesus in us, especially when you couple last week the types of soil, which we've already determined could very well mean that if we have good soil in the seed that Jesus plants in us, it will bear fruit. How do we avoid becoming tares? How do we avoid having the weeds grow up among us? Something to think about, something that we can come back on. But I really want to think about the kingdom of heaven, kingdom of God aspect, because we will next week, kind of a spoiler, we're going to talk about various parables where Jesus uses the kingdom of heaven and he'll use the term the kingdom of God. And does it change if they're talking about separate things? If they're talking about how we are on earth versus how we are spiritually, physical action, deeds versus faith, does it change the meaning of the parable if they're interchangeable? Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. Anything else in this parable before we start to wrap it up? We got a couple more minutes. I just, if anybody has anything they want, anything that we didn't touch on, anything that we didn't cover that you say, hey, I really wish we'd, I'm curious about this. Okay. All right. If not, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to say goodbye first to the recording, because I think last week it didn't look very good. And then I'm going to, all right, first, appreciate everyone being with us. And I'm going to stop our recording.